gonna do it. Okay. Hello, my name is Charlie Saad, and I will be presenting today on behalf of the Agriculture Resilience Act team. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my team members for all their hard work, as well as our faculty advisor, Dr. Palmer, for all of his support. As it currently stands, the agriculture sector emits the most greenhouse gases after the energy sector. The Agriculture Resilience Act seeks to cut these emissions by 50% no later than 2030 and achieve net zero by 2040. While the bill offers a sweeping array of approaches to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions throughout the agriculture sector, for the purposes of this presentation, we will discuss two specific areas: soil carbon management and methane management. After describing the science and controversies associated with each management technique, we will touch up on some of the metrics used to measure the success of implementation. As you can see in this graph, the agriculture sector is responsible for over 9% of the US greenhouse gas emissions. Not only is this significant in its own right, it can represent an enormous challenge because only some facets of this problem are amenable to technological fixes, while many others require entirely new land management practices. Directing our attention to the bar at the top of the screen, this graphic clearly demonstrates that the largest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions come from agricultural soil management practices that release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. While this is a formidable challenge, it is also an opportunity because changes in land management practices can actually result in a significant increase in the sequestration of carbon dioxide, which would be an incredibly important tool in the effort to combat climate change. The bill pays special attention to the emissions of methane associated with the agricultural sector. Methane is a greenhouse gas that has a global warming potential approximately 30 times greater than CO2. This means that its short-term effects on the climate and warming are quite significant. By the same token, any reduction in methane, even if it means converting it into CO2, can have an immediate outsized benefit with regard to the climate. For the purposes of this presentation, we will be focusing on the methane emissions associated with manure management. However, it is important to note that enteric fermentation, or the methane produced during the course of a cow's digestive process, is also a significant source of emissions. Let's begin our examination of the proposed solutions with the bill as they relate to soil carbon management. Pictured here is Lonnie Estill from Bear Ranch showing off some homemade compost. Lanny raises cattle and sheep to produce wool for winter apparel companies such as the North Face. She's an avid practitioner of carbon farming, which takes local soil and climatic conditions into account to draw down as much CO2 from the atmosphere as possible. As Estill says, climate-friendly farming is just being aware of the soil. Her compost is a combination of manure and wood chips that is spread strategically throughout the ranch in order to increase photosynthetic activity and turn carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. She also makes use of silvopasture, which is a land management technique that uses trees and shrubs as a grazing source in pastured areas. The use of compost and silvopasture have both increased soil organic carbon, which has many additional benefits such as increased water retention, boosted soil resiliency, and improved nutrition. One of the benefits of carbon farming is that soil organic carbon serves as an organic fertilizer. Agricultural practices that disturb the soil, such as tilling, planting monocrops, removing crop residues, excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides, and overgrazing, expose the organic matter in the soil to oxygen and microbes, allowing it to be emitted and respired into the atmosphere. Increasing soil organic matter means that plants will take more nutrients from the surrounding soil complex instead of becoming dependent on external fertilizer inputs. This supports healthy soil communities and reduces the need for fossil fuels used in the creation of synthetic fertilizers, lowering greenhouse gas emissions in addition to sequestering carbon. This photo shows another example of a soil management solution included in the bill: integrated crop livestock systems. The family owns a Kerrison farm in southeastern Washington, utilizes cover crops after harvesting grain. Cover crops prevent erosion and soil degradation resulting from bare soil left between crop yields. Their sheep then eat the forage of the cover crop, turning it into milk for lambs and meat for local markets, all the while assisting with weed management and helping the soil system reutilize nutrients. Using an integrated crop livestock system averts issues that arise from industrial livestock systems, such as high water demand needed for livestock feed or rampant spread of pathogens. Soils can sequester large amounts of carbon dioxide and play an important role in mitigating climate change. With that being said, there are several limitations to this process. Although large amounts of carbon can be stored initially, soils can become saturated after 10 to 100 years depending on the climate, soil type, and how it is managed. With proper intervention, scientists estimate that soil carbon sequestration could be between 2 and 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. While this is only 5 to 15% of the carbon currently produced by the energy sector, it will have a significant role to play in reversing climate change as emission levels begin to decline. Of course, much of this potential depends on local livestock and grazing practices, which can sometimes be detrimental to soil carbon. Setting that aside, if all the lands under human management sequestered the maximum amount of carbon possible, we could reduce atmospheric concentration of CO2 back to pre-industrial levels. Next, we will turn our attention to the proposed solutions within the bill to limit the methane emissions that result from anaerobic digestion. Let's begin our discussion of the use of anaerobic digesters with an example from a dairy farm in California. Carlos and Felix Echeverria are two second-generation dairy farmers who were initially reluctant to spend extra money on monitoring their methane emissions, much less capturing them. That all changed when funds from California's cap and trade bill were used to sponsor a third party to build, operate, and maintain an anaerobic digester on their land. Now Carlos and Felix perform limited maintenance and earn regular payments for the biogas that they send to the grid. Anaerobic digestion is a biological process by which microorganisms convert organic material into biogas in wet and anoxic conditions. This biogas includes carbon dioxide and methane, each of which is released freely into the atmosphere without intervention. In this graphic, the organic material inputs are livestock waste, which are processed to generate biogas, as well as biosolids to be used as fertilizer or soil amendment. Anaerobic digesters capture the methane produced by open waste lagoons and turn it into energy. Anaerobic digesters can successfully prevent important amounts of methane from ever reaching the atmosphere. Critics, however, point out that the technology often costs millions of dollars to construct and almost always requires publicly backed financing in some fashion. This raises the question of whether it would be more appropriate to tax methane emissions rather than subsidize alternatives. Additionally, anaerobic digesters don't solve other environmental problems, such as the contamination of groundwater or the generation of local air pollution from the combustion of biogas. Each of these can pose as serious hazards for local communities, suggesting that policymakers should seek to phase out waste lagoons altogether rather than attempting to make them more environmentally friendly. Finally, more cost-effective alternatives do exist, such as pasture-based grazing, which avoids the problem of concentrated manure in the first place. Some argue that this livestock management method is inherently more benign and should be supported in lieu of concentrated feeding operations that produce large pits of animal waste. To understand the success of the Agriculture Resilience Act and determine whether or not the bill achieves its goal of a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, it is imperative to track both livestock production and the annual emissions associated from the agriculture sector. Tracking livestock production is an important means of estimating methane emissions. Existing data on production techniques and the numbers of livestock can be determined from the Department of Agriculture's county statistics. Additionally, the amount of methane emissions that have been avoided due to the use of anaerobic digesters can be determined by keeping track of the total number and capacity of digesters installed, as well as the total amount of energy that they produce. Finally, carbon accounting is a crucial method of keeping track of not only the emissions released into the atmosphere, but also the amount of carbon sequestered by the soil. Metrics such as the number of acres switched to integrated systems and monitoring efforts of soil carbon content all contribute to the larger picture of how successfully the bill is serving to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Addressing the emissions from the agriculture sector is only the first step in the transition towards a more sustainable food system. This bill prioritizes greenhouse gas reductions in the service of promoting human and animal well-being. The Act also allocates extensive funding into the research and development of new crop breeds and land management techniques that will simultaneously help abate emissions and sequester carbon. Food waste is another area of concern where resources are needlessly squandered, and the bill outlines several actions to help solve this problem that we weren't able to touch on today. All told, the practices discussed today are crucial strategies to meet the goal outlined in the bill of cutting emissions in half by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2040. That being said, it is important to recognize that they are only part of a much wider set of solutions. Thank you, and I can take any questions now.
Good job, Charlie. Do we have any questions? Actually, I'll ask a question while we wait for some questions to come in. My question is actually, anaerobic digestion is also used to process food waste in cities, and which is a different use than the one that you're describing here. Does does it make sense for that use as opposed to the use that you're describing in terms of farming?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that it absolutely does make sense to use anaerobic digesters to reutilize the methane emissions produced from food waste. But food waste have a lot of implicit emissions associated with producing them in the first place. And so the best thing that you can do with regard to food waste is try to prevent it from happening in the first place. So it's a useful tool in the portfolio of approaches, but it's not sufficient to mitigate the emissions overall.
No, I was thinking as an alternative to landfilling, which is the other thing they do with garbage in cities. So,
Oh yeah, that'd certainly be better than that.
okay, good response, Charlie. Any other questions? Okay,
We have a question from Jenny.
okay.
Great job, Charlie. I also wanted to know about food waste, but Professor already asked about that. My other question was, you mentioned that an alternative to the anaerobic digestion is just doing more pasture grazing farming. Did you look into just the impacts of that on land use? And is it possible to totally transition to that form of farming with the amount of land we have available in the US?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jenny. And so I'm not able to answer this to the degree of specificity that I would like, but the basic gist is that the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations that currently produce our meat, have so many external inputs, ultimately from fossil fuels, that it would be really challenging to achieve the same amounts of total meat production based off of the available amounts of land. With that being said, the use of pasture-based grazing is beneficial for several other reasons, namely that it can actually help to facilitate the storage of carbon in soils. And so if we are able to scale that up, particularly on marginal lands that could actually be restored to some extent, then it could potentially sort of achieve maybe perhaps the same magnitude, but I'm skeptical, and I don't have the exact numbers, but I don't think it would be able to achieve the same amount of meat output as the current system. So there are a lot of factors at play, but to answer your question, it couldn't really substitute in.
Okay, let's see if we can take one more question if we have one.
Great, we have 2 more questions. So Liz, you're welcome to ask your question.
Hi, Charlie. Great presentation. I have a question that kind of ties into what we were just talking about. So anaerobic digesters, how does the scale of the benefits they provide compare to the scale of the problem and how much we need to reduce carbon compared to, say, switching to pasture-based farming or similar practices?
Yeah, okay. So if we switch to pasture-based farming, that would be a driver of much more change, because it's important to remember that the anaerobic digesters that are used on this land are only able to produce usable amounts of energy because there is such a vast amount of fossil energy available to create the fertilizers, the food inputs, and the operations that go together. So the amount of methane that you actually recapture and get back to the grid as a percentage of the total amount of fossil fuels that went in to produce that in the first place is really marginal and quite slim. And so it's never going to be an ultimate solution. It's really something to sort of alleviate the short-term effects of methane emissions, but there's no way that it could be seen as a sort of panacea to this issue altogether.
Let's take that 4th question that I heard about and then conclude.
All right, so Allison says, great presentation, Charlie. My question is, does the effectiveness of these strategies to reduce carbon emissions for farmers vary depending on the climate where the farm is located? For example, are there differences between farms in the southern states versus northern states?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, some of the highest prospects we have for storing carbon on the soils are actually in tropical regions, because woody perennial plants that sequester the most amounts of carbon tend to proliferate to the greatest degree there. That's not to say that at more temperate latitudes, such as in the United States, you can't sequester carbon, but there are certainly differences, and a lot of that does have to do with the water availability, as well as the climate to facilitate year-round growing seasons. So in general, the tropics are a little bit more conducive to storing carbon, and then the temperate latitudes slightly less so, although you can still make a sizable impact.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlie. Wonderful presentation. Great job, group. And congratulations. So let's turn to our third